My name is Claire Whitfield, and I was 34 years old when I watched my mother reach for a velvet cord in front of 300 people, about to unveil my brother's name on a plaque for a building she had no idea I owned. She'd practiced her speech in the car on the way over. I'd practiced mine for 11 years. But here's what my mother didn't know. The ground underneath that plaque had my grandfather's name on a deed, long before it ever had a foundation poured into it. What I did next is why you're here. Welcome back to House of Secrets, where every house has a secret room, and the woman they forgot about has had the key the whole time. Before we go back to where this all started, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a second. I grew up in Harmons Creek, Ohio. Population 3,200, give or take whoever moved in or got buried that year. We had one diner, the Wagon Wheel, where the coffee was always a shade past burnt, and a waitress named Doreen had worked the counter so long there was a booth in the back unofficially named after her. We had one church, First Baptist, white clapboard, out on Route 9, where the Sunday Bulletin had the same typo for 6 straight years, because nobody thought it was worth fixing. We had a feed store, a hardware store, that had been 3 different hardware stores wearing the same building, and a water tower with wildcats painted on the side, left over from a football team that hadn't had a winning season since 1987. My family lived on Birch Hollow Road, in a house my grandfather built with his own hands in 1962. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom for the first 9 years of my life, and a single phone line on the kitchen wall, with a cord long enough to stretch into the pantry, which is where I used to sit when I wanted to hear a conversation nobody knew I was listening to. My mother, Linda, ran that house like a stage, and she was the only one allowed to deliver lines. My father, Richard, worked at the grain co-op for 31 years and learned early that the path of least resistance ran straight through staying quiet. He wasn't cruel. He was just absent in the specific way some men are present, physically there, opinion-free, sitting at the table and nowhere else. My brother Tyler was 18 months younger than me, and somehow always older in the family's eyes. His Little League trophies lined the mantel. Mine, from the science fair, the spelling bee, the county math competition, ended up in a shoebox in the hall closet, because as I once heard my mother say, not unkindly, just factually, the way you'd mention the weather, Claire doesn't need the encouragement. She's just built that way. That sentence did more to shape me than any trophy ever could have. Christmas worked the same way. Tyler's gifts came wrapped in paper from the goods store in Marion, with bows. Mine came in the same brown paper the feed store used for 50-pound bags, folded twice and taped, because, as my mother put it, "You've never cared about presentation, Claire." I was 11 the year I noticed this out loud, and my mother's response was to laugh and tell my father, at the table, in front of everyone, that I was too sensitive for my own good. I learned that year that the fastest way to be called sensitive in that house was to notice something true. The one person who saw me clearly was my grandfather, Walter. He lived in the converted garage out back, smelled like cedar shavings and Folgers coffee, and owned 340 acres of farmland that nobody in town thought was worth much. Flat, half of it in a floodplain, too far from the highway to interest anyone. He used to sit me on the tailgate of his truck on Sunday afternoons and tell me, "Land doesn't care who shouted loudest growing up, Claire Bear. Land remembers who shows up and pays attention." I didn't understand what he meant until I was 29 years old, alone in a hospital bed with a tube taped to my arm. By my early 30s, I'd built a career nobody in my family fully understood, and nobody asked about twice. I worked in commercial real estate development, specifically healthcare facilities. The unglamorous, paperwork-heavy intersection of land use, zoning, and 20-year financing structures that quietly make hospitals possible. I was good at it. I was quiet about it. And on the day my life split into a before and an after, none of that mattered to anyone at the kitchen table on Birch Hollow Road, because the only thing that mattered that month was that Tyler had gotten a promotion, and I had a surgery scheduled for the same Saturday. The diagnosis came in March, on a Tuesday, under humming fluorescent lights, and a faded poster about colon health that had clearly been on that wall since the Clinton administration. A mass on my ovary, 11 centimeters, almost certainly benign, but large enough that "we don't wait and see" was the exact phrase my doctor used. Surgery was scheduled for the second Saturday in June. I told my mother on a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. Tyler told her his promotion news the same week, on a call I'm told lasted closer to 40. This wasn't new. It had been building for years in increments small enough that I could have charted them on a graph, if I'd ever cared to. When I made partner track at 28, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," in the same flat tone she used for weather reports. When Tyler got his first promotion 2 years earlier, there was a sheet cake from the Good Bakery in Marion, 31 minutes away, because the wagon wheel didn't do sheet cakes. When I closed my first 8-figure deal, a $14.2 million ground lease for a surgical center outside Columbus, I mentioned it once, at Thanksgiving. My father said, "Pass the gravy." That was the whole response. It happened again, 2 years later, when I was promoted to senior associate at my firm, a title that came with a 41% raise and a corner office I'd worked 6 years for. I told my parents over Sunday dinner. My mother asked, in the same breath, whether Tyler had mentioned anything about a girlfriend. The conversation about my promotion lasted under a minute. The conversation about Tyler's non-existent love life lasted the rest of the meal, roughly 35 minutes, by the kitchen clock I kept glancing at without meaning to. Her indifference had become like weather you stop noticing. You just put on a coat and go outside, and you stop expecting the sky to apologize for itself. I didn't build my evidence file because I was upset. That part matters. I built it the way I built everything. Out of habit, the same instinct that made me keep every closing document and signed lease in folders labeled by date, because that's what a careful person does in my line of work. Somewhere around year 3 of my career, I started a second folder. Not work, family. The 17-day gap between Tyler's college graduation announcement, catered, 80-some guests, a banner, and the day I passed my commercial real estate certification exam, which got one text from my mother that read, in full, "Okay, good." I counted the words. 2. There was also the engagement that wasn't, 8 months with a man named Dean, ending quietly in October, 2 years before the surgery. I told my mother on a Friday. She asked one question: what will people think happened? Not whether I was okay, not whether I needed anything, just the optics, measured and filed in under 9 words. My father, when I told him separately that same week, said only, "Sorry to hear it, kiddo," and went back to the crossword, the way a man reads a grocery list. Present, polite, finished before you finish talking. My grandfather was the one who told me to keep paying attention, 3 years before he died, sitting on that same tailgate, the year I was 26, and had almost canceled the visit over a closing deadline. "You think because nobody claps for you, nobody's watching," he said. "I'm watching. And someday, somebody who actually matters will be too." He didn't explain what he meant. He just handed me a manila envelope and said, "Don't open this till I'm gone, and don't tell your mother I gave it to you." I put it in my safe deposit box in Marion and didn't think about it again for 4 years. Walter died 11 years before that surgery, of a heart attack, repairing a fence line on the back 40. My mother cried at the funeral in a way that filled the funeral home. Loud, theatrical, a performance for an audience that had mostly known Walter far better than she had. I didn't cry until I got home that night, alone, and even then it was quiet, the kind of grief that doesn't make noise, just sits on your chest like a stone you carry around for a while. 3 weeks after the funeral, I opened the envelope. Inside was a trust document, dated 19 years earlier, naming me, not my mother, not Tyler, me by full legal name, as sole successor trustee and ultimate beneficiary of the Whitfield Family Land Trust, holding all 340 acres on County Road 12. There was a handwritten letter folded behind it, 4 paragraphs, ending with a line I still have memorized. "Your mother thinks land is for people who matter to her. I think land is for people who'll still be standing when the noise stops. That's you, Claire Bear. Do something with it she can't take credit for." I didn't do anything with it for 2 years. I was still learning my industry, and frankly, I didn't know what doing something with it meant. Then, in an unrelated meeting with a regional health systems facilities team near Mansfield, I heard them mention they were stalled on a 42,000-square-foot surgical wing expansion because they couldn't find a developer willing to take on a 75-year ground lease at a rate that made sense for a nonprofit hospital. I sat there running floodplain and access numbers in my head and realized I already owned exactly what they needed, 6 miles from where I grew up. It took 18 months, $9.6 million in financing I structured personally, and 412 pages of zoning, environmental, and lease documentation to turn my grandfather's worthless farmland into the site of the new West Surgical Wing of Crawford Regional Medical Center. The lease ran 75 years, renewable, with my development entity, which I'd named Walden Ridge Holdings, after him, holding fee-simple title to the land and a reversionary interest in the building at lease end. I told no one in my family, not because it was a secret in any dramatic sense, because nobody had ever once asked me a question about my work that wasn't immediately followed by a request to talk about Tyler's. My surgery, it turned out, was scheduled at Crawford Regional, in the West Wing, the one with my grandfather's name quietly sitting on the underlying parcel in county records. Nobody in my family had ever once thought to check. I told my mother the surgery date in May. She said, "Oh, that's the same weekend as Tyler's party." I told her the date wasn't flexible. The surgical block had a 6-week wait if I rescheduled. She said, "Well, I'm sure you'll be fine, honey. You're tough." And the call ended 90 seconds later because Tyler was calling on the other line. Tyler's promotion party, regional director, a logistics company out of Columbus, was held at the VFW Hall. My mother spent $3,400 on decorations and catering through Marino's and Marion. 140 guests. A banner that read, "Congratulations, Tyler," in gold letters 4 feet wide. I know the numbers because my Aunt Pam sent me photos afterward, unprompted, the way people do when they think they're being kind and have no idea they're handing you evidence. The party was on a Saturday. My surgery was on a Saturday. Same Saturday. 11 miles apart. Has anyone ever made you feel like your pain mattered less than someone else's good news? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story already feels a little too familiar, go ahead and subscribe now, because what happens next is the part where everything turns. The surgery took 4 hours and 12 minutes, longer than expected, because the mass had attached itself to tissue my surgeon wanted to handle carefully. I came out of anesthesia at 4:50 in the afternoon, in a recovery bay in the west wing of Crawford Regional, and before I even asked for water, I checked my phone. One text from my father. Hope it went okay. Sent at 2:14. 11 words. Nothing from my mother. Not one missed call. Not one text. I checked twice, because the nurse thought the anesthesia had me confused, and I had to explain, as flatly as I could manage, that no, I understood exactly what I was looking for. There just wasn't anything there. I found out 3 days later, from Aunt Pam's photos, that my mother gave a toast at Tyler's party that included the line, "I've always believed in this family showing up for each other, no matter what." She said it at 6:40 p.m., the photo's timestamp, which was 1 hour and 50 minutes after I came out of anesthesia, 11 miles away, alone, with a beeping monitor, and a nurse named Denise, who held my hand for a few minutes because, she said, "You shouldn't be the only one who knows you're awake." I spent 6 days in that recovery bay and a rental room nearby. My mother called twice during those 6 days, both times to ask if I'd seen the party photos yet. She never once asked what they removed, or whether it was benign. It was. 11 centimeters, fully resected, clean margins. I said that out loud to the nurse, just to hear someone respond to it. I didn't decide to do anything about any of this in that recovery bay. I want to be honest about that part, because this isn't a story about a woman plotting from a hospital bed. I decided 4 months later, on a Tuesday, when Crawford Regional's facilities director called my office to schedule a walkthrough ahead of the wing's public dedication ceremony, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the board was finalizing donor recognition language and wanted to confirm the Whitfield family's wishes for the plaque, since the underlying land parcel was held under that name in county filings. I hadn't thought about the plaque. I'd structured the lease, financed the build, and moved on to other projects in the 18 months since. But sitting in my office that Tuesday, reading the draft language the board's communications team had prepared, generic, respectful, mentioning the Whitfield family's generosity without specifying which Whitfield, I understood exactly what was about to happen if I didn't say something. I sat with that printout for 11 minutes before I did anything at all. I didn't call anyone. I didn't draft an email. I just read the same paragraph 4 times, the way you'd reread a clause in a contract you already know you're going to sign, just to be sure you understood every word of what you were agreeing to. Then, I closed the file, put it in the drawer where I kept the original trust documents, and waited. 2 weeks later, my mother called, the first call she'd initiated in 11 months that wasn't a forwarded group text, to tell me, breathlessly, that Tyler had been asked by Crawford Regional's board to say a few words representing the family at the dedication, because the hospital's development office had reached out to the Whitfield family on the property records, and naturally, she said, naturally, she'd given them Tyler's number, since you're always so busy, and he's better in front of people anyway. I asked her, calmly, whether she knew which Whitfield was actually on those property records. She laughed, the specific laugh she used when a question felt beneath answering, and said, "Honey, it's a family name. It doesn't matter which Whitfield. We're all the same family." I called my attorney, Margaret Halloway, the next morning. I'd hired Margaret 8 years earlier, back when Walden Ridge was nothing but a name on a folder and a stack of zoning maps spread across my kitchen table. She was recommended by a colleague who said simply, "She doesn't talk you out of things. She just makes sure you can defend them." In 8 years, Margaret had never once asked me why I was doing any of this quietly. She just made sure that whenever I finally needed the paperwork to speak, it would speak clearly. Margaret had handled every piece of the Walden Ridge paperwork from day one, drafted the trust amendment that converted Walter's land trust into the holding entity, negotiated the lease terms with the hospital's council, and happened to be the only adult in my life who'd ever asked me a follow-up question about my own work. I told her what was happening. She pulled the file and confirmed what I already knew. The lease contained a donor recognition clause, requiring written sign-off from the fee owner, me, before any name, plaque, or public credit could attach to the project. Then she said something I haven't forgotten since. "Claire, you've spent your whole life letting people assume things about you because correcting them felt exhausting. You don't have to argue with your mother. You just have to let the paper speak first." I didn't tell my mother any of this. I didn't tell Tyler, who I was fairly sure had no idea he'd just been handed a role he never auditioned for. I let 4 more weeks pass. I let the invitations go out. I let my mother tell Aunt Pam this was going to be Tyler's moment. I let her plan an outfit and rehearse, in the car, on the drive there. Pam told me this part later, a speech that opened with the words, "I've always believed in supporting this family's success." I just made sure Margaret would be standing 6 feet from the podium, holding a manila folder, on the day it mattered. The ceremony was held on the front lawn of the West Wing on a Saturday in September, under a white event tent, with folding chairs for about 300 people, and a podium carrying the hospital system's navy blue banner. The plaque itself sat under a black velvet cloth on an easel near the entrance, waiting. The grass had just been cut that morning. I remember the smell, sharp and green, mixing with the diesel from the catering truck idling near the parking lot, and somewhere behind the tent, a generator humming low and steady under all of it, the kind of sound you stop hearing until it stops. I arrived 11 minutes before it started, in a gray suit, and took a seat in the 4th row. My mother spotted me from the front row, beside Tyler, who looked uncomfortable in a way that made me feel something close to sympathy. He hadn't asked for this any more than I'd asked for my surgery to land on his party date. My mother gave a small, surprised wave, the kind reserved for someone whose attendance wasn't expected, but wasn't unwelcome either, as long as I stayed in my seat and let the day belong to someone else. That had always been the arrangement. The hospital's CEO spoke first. 11 minutes about community partnership and patient care, statistics about the wing's 42 exam and surgical rooms, and its impact on regional wait times. Then the board chair introduced the family behind the land this wing stands on, and gestured toward the front row. My mother stood first. Tyler stood half a beat behind her, unsure if he was supposed to. My mother reached the podium and delivered exactly the speech Pam had described from the car. I've always believed in supporting this family's success. Her chin lifting slightly on the word always, the particular tell she'd had since I was a child, the one that surfaced whenever she rewrote something in real time and needed her own face to believe it before anyone else's did. She gestured for Tyler to step beside her. She reached for the velvet cord. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't walk fast. I walked the way I walk into any closing meeting. Level, unhurried, like a woman who already knows how the numbers come out. Before you unveil that, I said, I think the board should clarify which Whitfield is actually on the deed. My voice carried exactly as far as it needed to, and no farther. The board chair, who'd clearly spoken with Margaret the week before, said, Yes, we do need to clarify that. The land underlying this entire facility is held by Walden Ridge Holdings, a development entity wholly controlled by Claire Whitfield, under a 75-year ground lease with the hospital system. Per that lease, all donor recognition language requires Ms. Whitfield's written approval. My mother's jaw tightened, just slightly, the way it did whenever a sentence she expected to land simply didn't. Her face didn't crumble. It just stopped. The particular stillness a face gets when it runs out of script mid-sentence, with no understudy ready. Her hand stayed on the velvet cord, unmoving, for 4 full seconds. I counted later, from the ceremony video the hospital posted online. Tyler turned and looked at me, and what crossed his face wasn't anger. It was something closer to relief. A man handed a script in a language he didn't speak, quietly told he didn't have to read it after all. Margaret walked forward from where she'd been standing near the registration table, unhurried, and set a single manila folder on the small table beside the podium, not handing it to anyone, not opening it, just placing it down with both hands, flat, the way you set down something heavy without wanting it to make a sound. She didn't look at my mother. She looked at me, once, and gave a small nod. The kind that doesn't ask a question and doesn't need an answer. The kind that simply says, "It's done," and it was done correctly. Then she stepped back, hands folded, and let the folder do what folders do. Nobody opened it. Nobody needed to. Everyone under that tent understood, in the way a room understands a held breath, that it existed, that it had my name and a notary stamp inside it, and that it had been sitting there the entire time, the whole speech, the whole rehearsed line about always believing, waiting the way paper waits, patient as a deed in a county filing cabinet, for someone to finally need it. For a few seconds, the only sound was the tent fabric snapping once against a gust of wind. Then nothing. The plaque was unveiled 20 minutes later, after a quiet conversation between the board chair, my mother, and me, off to the side of the tent, that lasted 90 seconds, and that nobody else heard. I told the board I had no objection to recognizing the Whitfield family generally. I asked for one specific addition. A line, smaller type, beneath the main inscription, reading, "In memory of Walter Whitfield, who never stopped believing the land would matter." They agreed before I finished the sentence. My mother didn't apologize that day, and she still hasn't. Not in the way you'd see in a movie. What she did, in the parking lot afterward, while Tyler loaded folding chairs into his truck and the catering crew broke down the tent, was stand near my car a moment longer than necessary and say quietly, not looking at me, "Your grandfather always did like you best." It wasn't an apology. It was the closest thing to true she'd said to me in years, and I let it be enough, because waiting for more would have meant staying angry at a woman who, I'd come to understand, simply didn't have more to give. My father called 2 days later, something he almost never initiated, and didn't mention the ceremony at all. He just asked how I was healing. 4 months after a surgery he hadn't asked about once at the time. It wasn't much, but it was the first follow-up question he'd asked me in over a decade, and I took it the way you take rain after a long dry spell. Not as an apology from the sky. Just water, finally, doing what water does. Tyler and I talk now, occasionally, in a way we never did growing up. He told me once, over coffee at the wagon wheel, that he never wanted to be the favorite. I believe him. It cost him something too, just a different currency than what it cost me. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't even correct the family group chat the next week when Aunt Pam wrote, "What a beautiful day. So proud of this family." I let it stand. Some things aren't worth the paper. My mother and I still talk, maybe twice a month, about nothing important. The weather, the wagon wheel's new menu, whether the water tower needs repainting. We don't talk about June. We don't talk about the folder. Some doors don't need to be slammed to close. Some of them just click shut, quietly, and you let them. I had Margaret update the trust that winter, adding a clause that didn't exist before. A scholarship, funded through Walton Ridge, for one nursing student from Harmons Creek every year. No application essay required, just a transcript and a letter from a teacher. I named it after no one. I didn't need my name on anything else that year. I'd already gotten what I needed, 4 seconds, and one folder at a time. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from tonight, it's this. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard, and you don't have to win the argument in the room, to win the thing that actually matters. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for the people who never noticed you is keep building, quietly, until the building speaks for itself. I didn't get the mother I wanted that day. I got something else instead. Proof, finally on the record, that I was never invisible. I was just early. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who spent their whole life showing up and never getting thanked for it. They need to hear this today, not someday. And if you're new here, what would you have done standing in that tent? Tell me below. Subscribe to House of Secrets for more stories like this one every week. I'll see you in the next one.